What happens when a professor tries to publicly undermine someone she assumes to be out of place, only to realize she just challenged not an ordinary celebrity, but Keanu Reeves, a man whose intellect goes far beyond the silver screen? Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll see Keanu in a way you never expected. At one of America's most prestigious universities, Dr. Linda Markham was known for two things: her expertise in advanced mathematics and her increasingly noticeable political agenda. That morning, as students filled the lecture hall, something felt different. Instead of complex equations, the whiteboard displayed a bold message. Today's topic: redefining academic priorities. In the back of the room, a man dressed in a simple yet elegant black suit sat quietly. Unlike the students surrounding him, he wasn't there for a degree. He was Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood legend known for his humility and intelligence. What most people didn't realize was that behind his soft-spoken demeanor lay a deep love for mathematics, a subject he had studied extensively in private. Dr. Markham began her lecture, but it wasn't about calculus. Instead, she spoke about the need to shift academic priorities away from theoretical mathematics toward what she called real-world social applications. Some students exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the lesson was becoming more of a social commentary than an academic discussion. Then, Keanu calmly raised his hand. But Markham hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. She hadn't expected any interruptions, especially not from him. She continued speaking, clicking through slides that displayed gender representation statistics instead of mathematical formulas. Some of you, she said, her gaze lingering on certain students, might need to accept that your privilege has given you an unfair advantage in this class. Keanu's hand remained raised, patient, steady. Students started to murmur among themselves, some glancing back at him, others exchanging looks of curiosity. But before acknowledging him, Dr. Markham pushed forward. For example, she continued, shifting her tone to something more pointed, family connections and wealth can create artificial advantages in education. The implication was clear, and several students turned to see how Keanu would react, but his expression remained composed. His hand was still raised. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Markham sighed and acknowledged him. "Yes, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "Do you have something to contribute to our discussion about privilege in education?" The room fell completely silent. People knew Keanu Reeves as an actor, but few were aware of his genuine intellectual curiosity. He was known for his dedication to learning, often spotted reading philosophy or deep in conversation with scientists. As he lowered his hand and began to speak, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold in that classroom. His voice was calm, measured, and respectful. "Dr. Markham, I believe mathematics is fundamental to understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us, myself included, have come here today expecting to deepen our mathematical knowledge. Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum potentially disadvantage all students, regardless of their background?" A few students nodded in agreement, but Dr. Markham's expression hardened. She wasn't about to let an actor, no matter how famous, challenge her authority. Keanu paused briefly before speaking again, his voice steady. "Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum potentially disadvantage all students, regardless of their background?" Several students nodded in agreement, clearly relieved that someone had the courage to challenge the professor's shift away from academic rigor. But Dr. Markham's expression hardened. She crossed her arms, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Reeves," she said, emphasizing his last name, "perhaps you of all people should understand how privilege shapes our educational system. After all, not everyone has the luxury of private tutors and an elite education." What happened next stunned the entire class. Instead of getting defensive, Keanu simply smiled. A warm, understanding smile, not one of arrogance, but of genuine humility. "You're right about one thing, Professor," he said thoughtfully. "I have been fortunate in my education. That's exactly why I believe we have a responsibility to maintain high academic standards, so that everyone, no matter their background, has a real chance to reach their full potential." A flicker of uncertainty flashed across Dr. Markham's face. She hadn't expected that response, but she quickly regained her composure and leaned forward, her tone laced with sarcasm. "And you think you know better than a professor about maintaining academic standards?" she scoffed. Tell me, Mr. Reeves, what exactly makes you such an expert on mathematical education? Keanu remained calm, his expression as composed as ever. I'm not claiming to be an expert, he replied. I'm simply someone who appreciates the beauty of mathematics and believes it transcends political divisions. He gestured toward the blank whiteboard, still untouched by any actual calculus content. Instead of debating privilege, he continued, why don't we spend this time exploring the incredible complexities of calculus? After all, isn't that why we're here? The class fell into a tense silence. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed dangerously. Without another word, she turned toward the board, grabbing a marker. Very well, Mr. Reeves. Since you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test. She began writing rapidly, her hand moving with deliberate speed. Students gasped as the equation took shape. It wasn't just any calculus problem. This was the kind of complex integration and series expansion that even graduate students struggled with. A few students whispered nervously. That's way beyond our level, someone muttered. But Keanu's expression didn't change. He remained completely unfazed. Dr. Markham turned back to him with a smirk. Since you're so concerned about maintaining standards, she said, her voice thick with mockery, why don't you go ahead and solve this? Unless, of course, you'd rather go back to discussing Hollywood and your so-called privilege instead. The challenge hung in the air. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing this as a clear attempt at public humiliation. Keanu simply stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket before making his way toward the board. His movements were calm, unhurried, completely at ease. Dr. Markham's Parmesan smirk widened. She had chosen this problem specifically because it required techniques she hadn't yet taught, techniques that were far beyond the scope of their coursework. But as Keanu took the marker from her hands, studying the equation with genuine curiosity rather than intimidation, something about his demeanor made her smile falter slightly. He turned to the class. Before I begin, he said, his voice smooth and thoughtful, I noticed that this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard method? Or would you like to see a more efficient solution I learned while studying Leibniz's original papers? Dr. Markham's expression froze. The casual reference to Leibniz's work caught her completely off guard. You've read Leibniz's original papers? She asked, unable to hide her surprise. Keanu nodded. Yes, he replied simply, in German. The translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology. A hushed murmur rippled through the class. This was not going the way Dr. Markham had expected. And as Keanu turned back to the board, marker poised to begin, the entire classroom held its breath, because something extraordinary was about to happen. Keanu nodded at Dr. Markham's question, his response effortlessly composed. Yes, he said simply. In German, the translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology. A hushed murmur swept through the class. Then turning back to the board, marker in hand, he added, but perhaps we should let the mathematics speak for itself. The silence in the room deepened. Dr. Markham's challenge had just taken an unexpected turn. As Keanu began writing his first line of the solution, no one, not even the professor, could predict what was about to unfold. Students watched in stunned silence as Keanu's hand moved across the whiteboard with practiced precision. Each step was clear, deliberate, and surprisingly elegant. But what truly captivated the room wasn't just the fact that he was solving the problem, it was how he explained every step along the way. This first step, he explained calmly, uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. His marker glided effortlessly across the board. It simplifies what appears complex into something much more approachable. Dr. Markham's confident expression began to waver. She followed his work carefully, realizing that Keanu wasn't just solving the problem, he was teaching it. Several students instinctively pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Even those who normally struggled with calculus found themselves understanding his approach. Then, Keanu reached a crucial point in the solution. Now, he said, stepping back slightly, we have two paths forward. He turned to Dr. Markham. The traditional method would take another full board, he explained, but there's a more elegant approach using Leibniz's original insights. Which would you prefer to see, Professor? Dr. Markham stood frozen, Her earlier smugness had completely evaporated. This wasn't just a question about mathematical preference. It was a gentle but undeniable reminder of the depth of knowledge she had so easily dismissed. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, something unexpected happened. A hand shot up from the middle of the class. Could we see both? Asked Sarah Chen, one of the quieter students. This is actually helping me understand the chapter we covered last week better. Keanu smiled warmly at Sarah. Then turning back to Dr. Markham, he raised an eyebrow in silent question. Her response would reveal more than just her mathematical preference. It would show whether she was willing to recognize when a teaching moment transcended personal bias. Before she could answer, the classroom door suddenly burst open. Dean Richardson, a known ally of Dr. Markham's academic and political views, strode in. "Linda," he announced hurriedly, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the new curriculum changes." The timing couldn't have been worse for Dr. Markham, or perhaps it couldn't have been better. She seized the opportunity. "We'll have to continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. But before she could step away, Keanu spoke up. His voice carried a quiet authority that made even the dean pause. "Professor," he said, "you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone." The class erupted into murmurs. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity. The dean's face reddened. "Young man, are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Keanu interrupted, polite but firm. "I'm stating a fact. Dr. Markham issued a public challenge to prove a point about privilege and merit. I accepted. The only question is, will she honor her own challenge?" The tension in the room was electric. Several students had their phones recording, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Dr. Markham looked trapped between her ally and her own actions. The dean shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to assert his authority or back down. Then Keanu did something unexpected. He handed the marker back to Dr. Markham. "Or perhaps," he said with a slight smile, "you'd prefer to show us your solution first? After all, as you mentioned earlier, family connections shouldn't matter. Only knowledge should. And surely as our professor, you can solve the very problem you presented, can't you?" A deafening silence filled the room. Dr. Markham stared at the marker in her hand, and for the first time since the lecture began, she realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. Keanu's words hung in the air like a challenge no one had anticipated. "You'd prefer to show us your solution first?" he asked, his voice calm but unwavering. "After all, as you mentioned earlier, family connections shouldn't matter. Only knowledge should. And surely as our professor, you can solve the very problem you presented, can't you?" A deafening silence filled the classroom. Dr. Markham stared at the marker in her hand, her fingers tightening around it. For the first time, the dean's presence no longer felt like a rescue. It felt like another witness to what was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension. Mr. Markham's knuckles turned white as she gripped the marker. The dean shifted uncomfortably beside her, sensing that this was no longer just a classroom discussion, it was something far bigger. Students held their breath, phones still recording. They knew they were watching a defining moment. Dr. Markham started, then stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the equation she had written, the very problem she had chosen specifically to humiliate someone else. And now it was a sword hanging over her own head. Keanu saw the hesitation, but instead of pressing further, he offered something unexpected. "Perhaps," he said, his voice gentle, not mocking, "we could solve it together. Sometimes collaboration leads to better understanding." The class held its breath. There was no triumph in his tone, no arrogance. It was a genuine offer, a chance to turn this moment of conflict into something constructive. But Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't let her accept it. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, throwing the marker down. "This entire display is nothing but a privileged celebrity trying to undermine my authority." A ripple of shock spread through the class. The dean, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. "Let's all take a step back," he said carefully, but Keanu's calm voice cut through the tension. "No," he said firmly, picking up the marker. "Let's take a step forward." He turned to the board and in a display of pure mathematical virtuosity, he completed both solutions, the traditional method and Leibniz's approach, in under 5 minutes. As he wrote the final line, the class erupted into spontaneous applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his amazement. But what happened next would reshape not just this class, but the entire department. Dr. Markham's face had gone from red to pale. Her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling before her eyes. But Keanu wasn't finished, and his next words would prove that true leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about building bridges. He turned away from the board, facing both Dr. Markham and the dean. "The beauty of mathematics," he said, "is that it doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases. It only cares about truth." He gestured to the solutions on the board. "These equations tell us something important, not just about calculus, but about learning itself. When we let our preconceptions cloud our judgment, we miss opportunities to grow." The dean cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that..." "That what?" A voice rang out from the back of the classroom. It was Michael Chen, a scholarship student who rarely spoke up. "That we should learn less math because of someone's political agenda?" A murmur swept through the class. One by one, students began standing up. "I came here to learn calculus," another student called out, "not to be lectured about my supposed privilege." Dr. Markham's carefully controlled classroom was unraveling. But instead of letting her face further humiliation, Keanu did something remarkable. "Professor," he said loud enough to quiet the growing dissent, "your mathematical knowledge is extensive. I've learned a lot from your technical lectures." Perhaps Keanu's voice remained steady as he offered a solution not just to the problem on the board, but to the tension in the room itself. "Perhaps we could focus on that," he suggested. "I'd be happy to assist other students after class, combining your theoretical expertise with practical problem solving." The offer hung in the air, a chance for Dr. Markham to save face while actually improving the class. The dean watched intently, realizing that this moment could either explode into a PR disaster or transform into something unexpectedly positive. Dr. Markham looked at Keanu. Then, for the first time, she truly looked at her students. And what she saw in their faces would force her to make a decision that would change everything. Her voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. She started, then straightened her shoulders. "I've made a terrible mistake." The admission seemed to cost her something, but something had shifted in her demeanor. "For years, I've been so focused on fighting perceived privilege that I became exactly what I claimed to oppose, someone who judges based on preconceptions rather than merit." She turned back to Keanu. "You didn't just solve that equation. You taught me something about true leadership." The dean stepped forward, sensing an opportunity. Perhaps this could be a model for other departments. Before he could spin this into an administrative victory, something unexpected happened. A commotion erupted outside the classroom. A crowd had gathered in the hallway, students from other classes, drawn by the viral videos being posted in real time. Some held up hastily made signs, scribbled on notebook paper. "Teach math, not politics. Merit over bias." The situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control. But once again, Keanu stepped up. He walked to the door, addressing the growing crowd with a voice that carried natural authority. "If you're here because you want to learn," he said, "then come in. There's plenty of room." Students flooded into the classroom, filling every available space. Dr. Markham watched in amazement as Keanu turned back to the board, marker in hand. "Now," he said, "who wants to learn about practical applications of calculus in real-world problem solving?" What happened in that classroom over the next hour would become university legend. But the real story wasn't about equations or politics. It was about something far more powerful. The story of what happened in Dr. Markham's calculus class spread like wildfire across campus, but not in the way anyone had predicted. Instead of becoming a tale of conflict and humiliation, it transformed into something much greater. In the weeks that followed, attendance in the advanced calculus class tripled. Students weren't just coming to learn math. They were coming to witness a remarkable partnership. Dr. Markham, humbled by her experience, returned to her true passion for mathematics. And Keanu, true to his word, began hosting study sessions that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. But the biggest change wasn't in the curriculum. It was in the culture. The class became a place where questions were welcomed, where merit truly mattered, and where learning transcended political divisions. Students who once felt intimidated by the subject or the atmosphere now found themselves excelling. One day, as Keanu was helping a struggling student master a difficult concept, Dr. Markham approached him. "You know," she said, "you could have destroyed my career that day." She paused, then added, "Instead, you helped it save it." She hesitated for a moment before continuing, "Your father would be proud." Keanu's response reflected wisdom far beyond his years. The goal was never to tear anyone down, Professor. It was to lift everyone up. The lesson that lasted beyond one classroom. Today, that calculus class serves as a reminder of something far greater than mathematics. It's a testament to the idea that true education isn't about power struggles or political agendas. It's about the pursuit of knowledge, the courage to stand up for what's right, and most importantly, the wisdom to do so with grace. And Keanu Reeves? He still sits in the back of the class. He still helps struggling students. And he still believes that the greatest privilege of all is the opportunity to learn. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you thought about this episode. See you in the next video.